Well, welcome everybody once again to the briefing room. And today I'm continuing my uh, pursuit of talking about women in World War II. And today we're going to be talking to Anne Sebba. Welcome, Anne Sebba, to the briefing room.
Great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. And we're going to be talking about your book, The Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, which I
Thank you.
believe I believe this comes out in paperback in March.
Let me just go and show you. I got the first copies yesterday.
Oh, fantastic.
So that's what the paperback looks like. Can you see?
Yeah, just about. Brilliant.
Good. Well,
Brilliant. So I'll be putting a link down below so everybody can go and
thank you.
grab a
Great.
copy. And I've never heard about this story before. How did you come across it?
Well, that's why I'm so pleased to be telling the story of these. I mean, it's called the Women's Orchestra, but actually it was a girls' band. That's what
Hmm.
they called themselves. And many of them were just teenagers. So I came across it because I'd been researching for a long time stories about Belsen. I've
Hmm.
always thought that what the British Army did in subduing the Germans and the horrors of Belsen, medically, nutritionally, and just socially and emotionally, all these people trapped in this camp with nowhere to go, and the British Army had no idea what they would find. And David Dimbleby's broadcast was so shocking that the BBC at first wouldn't broadcast what he had seen.
Okay.
I mean, Richard Dimbleby, not David Dimbleby, of course. And so, nobody really could believe the horrors. But when I was researching Belsen, I discovered that actually my father, who was a British tank driver, had been in Belsen a week after liberation. I'd always known that, but he was never prepared to talk about it. He just said, well, I was there a week after
Mhm.
liberation, so that's nothing. But when I finally got to research his papers, I saw that actually he was in charge of sending the Churchill flamethrower tanks in to destroy the
Wow.
lice ridden huts on May the 24th. And on that same day, May the 24th, the remnants of the women's orchestra were giving a Red Cross concert because it was after liberation, and so the Red
Mhm.
Cross was in there trying to restore normality. So it was really, once I discovered the synchronicity of these two dates, I couldn't leave it alone.
Mm.
And then I realized that actually the orchestra had come to Belsen from Auschwitz. So that's what triggered it.
Fantastic. That's because, like I say, I've never heard of it before. And this was reading your book. It was fascinating to see what they went through. And
Mm.
to begin with, what was the situation like for Jewish women musicians before the deportations?
Well, do you mean in their home countries of
Yeah.
Austria or, well, once the Nazis took control in countries like Poland or Austria or Germany, they didn't have the opportunities to play. So there was something in Germany called the Jüdisches Kulturband, where they could play to Jewish audiences
Mhm.
and only promote it to Jewish people, and that really was very unsatisfactory. But for some people who thought, well, this madness won't last long, I'll do it just to keep going, they did that for a year until the Nazis forbade that. But generally, Jewish musicians couldn't find anyone to teach them, and
Mhm.
and so it was impossible. Everybody knew they had to get out, but they couldn't get out. They had no money, or they had to leave everything behind. So, it was just um, real luck if you were able to play in any way in a school by the time you were deported to Auschwitz.
And can you talk a little bit about the individual journeys of the musicians to Auschwitz?
Well, there are 40 of them, or 45, so I
Just
won't I won't say all of
not
them.
all
I
40.
mean, well, let me just give you an overview of
Yeah.
the orchestra. So, there were 11 nations involved in this. It was the
Mhm.
only all-female orchestra in any of the camps or prisons or ghettos. There were several male orchestras. The journey was, if you were Jewish, you were deported to a camp. And
Mm,
if you were deported to Auschwitz, you were quote unquote fortunate because from 1943 onwards, there was an orchestra. So when Jews were deported to Auschwitz, if they were old, and that means anyone over 40, or if they were
mhm,
young, and that means anyone under 10 or so, you were just gassed straight away. No chance of living. If you
mm,
looked fit and strong and healthy, you might be brought into the camp. And if you were brought into the camp, you had a chance of life if you went into the laundry, the office, the sorting warehouse, which was known as Canada, those sort of things, or the kitchen. You had a reasonable chance you might live a bit longer.
mhm,
If you were sent out to work in the fields in a wrecking commando or in one of the sub camps or dredging the fields, that was utterly exhausting work and they all hated it. And in order to count the women doing that, and in order to chivvy them on to march in rows of five, the Nazis came up with this idea of a marching band because it made it easier for them to count. So they would go
yeah,
5, 10, 15, 20. So once the orchestra was set up, this all female orchestra, at first it was only Christian Polish women who were older, and
mm,
many of them had already been in prison in Poland for resisting the Nazis. And then eventually they realized that that was floundering. It was never going to be good enough. And here were all these Jewish musicians pouring into the camp. They'd better have Jewish musicians as well. So it gradually increased until it reached its peak of about 45 members, but they all had different stories. I mean, I could tell you, for example, about the Greeks, because nobody can believe that Greek people were deported to Auschwitz. It's a 10 or 11-hour journey. I mean,
yeah,
it makes no sense. Well, none of it makes any sense. But
mm,
so these Greek women that I've written about, they came from a family of musicians, the Assales, and there was a brother and two sisters. Lily was a professional musician in her 30s, and her younger sister Yvette was very talented, but just learning. And when they arrived with their whole family, Yvette, the teenager, one of the youngest, she was about 15, saw her mother and aunt be sent off to the line for gassing and wanted to run after them. And
mm,
her older sister pulled her back and said, "No, this is the line you want to be in." Some intuition told her that. And although the two sisters survived, and indeed the brother, Lily really never forgave. I mean, Yvette never really forgave her older sister Lily, not so much for saving her life, but for not letting her die with her mother. She said, "I should have gone with my mother. That's where I wanted to be."
yeah,
So, these are very complicated motivations. Although the
yeah,
three Greeks survived, the siblings, and actually I'm in touch with their children in New York, and there was a concert in New York last week for Holocaust Memorial Day, and their children came to this concert. I can't tell you how moving that was. So,
mm,
you
okay.
know, the chance of life was extraordinary, but it came at a high price. So, there are Polish Christians, Polish Jews. There was one Czech, one Dutch accordionist, Germans, Austrians, French, Belgians, and Greeks. It was an absolute Tower of Babel
Mm.
inside, but somehow they pulled through when they needed to and played these
It,
marching tunes.
and did the Germans just the Nazis just ask who could play, or did they recognize sort of famous faces as they went into Auschwitz?
No, these weren't famous
No.
people, other than one exception, Alma Rose, and perhaps we'll come to
Hmm.
talk about her in some detail. I think that's the point of my book. These were
Yeah.
very, very ordinary people, kids and girls, who most of whom would never have had a career as professional musicians. There was a Belgian girl called Hélène Wiernik, who was really very talented. She was known as La Grande Hélène in the orchestra, not because she was big or tall, but because she played in the first desk. She was concertmaster and she was
Mm.
really very talented. And she gave up after the war. She just said, I didn't have the physical strength or the emotional strength. So um, it wasn't that they were famous faces. There were really only about 4 or 5 good enough musicians who
Mm.
carried the kids at the back. And Alma Rosé, this extraordinary conductor who ran the orchestra for about 8.5 months, and she really saved the lives. She made them work, and she made the ones at the front carry the kids at the back. So there were piccolos and flutes and recorders. I mean, I've got grandchildren who probably have played the recorder for a couple of years. The
Mm.
idea that their lives would depend on how well they played in
Yeah.
an orchestra when they had no food, freezing cold, fear. It's just so hard to get your mind around all these factors that were going on at the same time. And Alma really brought them all together and forced them to play. And if they weren't very good, the ones at the back were told, well, just, do a down bow in time. So boom, 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 boom. And to that extent, marching music was quite helpful because it's got this strong, regular beat. But
Yeah.
I think the point I'm trying to make is that these were you and me,
Yeah.
just ordinary people who saw a chance of life and they seized it. And to hell with whatever was going on, they just thought, well, if I can live to tomorrow or tomorrow and tomorrow, I may just get out of here alive. And they
I could
did.
I could see your real passion for this story. It's obvious in the way that you speak. It's fantastic. And talking about Alma Rose, who was she? What was her background?
Yeah. Well, Alma Rosé really is a book on its own. There was a sort of not wonderful biography of her, but it was helpful. It was written a long time ago, and there's new material since. But um, Alma Rosé was the niece of Gustav Mahler. Gustav Mahler converted to Catholicism, although he was born Jewish. Alma's mother was Justine, the sister, and she converted. Alma's father was Arnold Rosé, who was a really top-notch Viennese violinist, concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic, and he converted to Protestantism. So Alma was baptized. She'd been into a synagogue. She did not believe she was Jewish, but
Mm.
according to Nazi racial laws, of course, she was.
Yeah.
She had Jewish blood. So the story of Alma is she was brought up in this culture of excellence, expected to be an absolutely top notch virtuoso violinist. And she was pretty good. Whether she was absolutely up there at the top, we'll never know because she made a marriage to a big celebrity violinist called Vasha Prioda, a Czech. And the marriage was a disaster, really. There was
Mm.
no room for two virtuoso violinists. So, according to the mores of the time, they divorced, and Alma um, became a leader of a troupe of female violinists, the Waltzing Maidens, they were called. She took them around Europe. So she was no longer a solo performer. And then at the outbreak of war, her mother died. Her father was too old really to play and earn a living, and he was
Hmm.
Jewish, in spite of converting. So she got her father to England and settled him in Blackheath. And then she thought, well, how's he going to earn any money? I'd better go back into Europe where I'm well known. I can earn a bit of money and send it to him. But she was a risk taker and foolish, and she was betrayed and caught by the Nazis and
Mm.
sent to Auschwitz. Now, she was 36, so of childbearing age, and the worst fate of all was awaiting her. She was not gassed immediately, and she wasn't brought into Auschwitz Birkenau to run or even be in the orchestra. She was sent to this pseudo scientific block to have an experiment on her to test her fertility and sterility. And yeah, you're right to shake your head. It's
Mm.
so grim. And
Yeah.
she knew she'd die on the operating table with no anesthetic. So, as a dying wish, she asked for a violin. Well, there were many fine instruments in this warehouse called Canada, because
Mm.
when Jews were deported, they were told to bring their most precious possessions. Many of them brought violins. So somebody brought Alma a violin and she played her heart out. And it was immediately apparent that, this is no
Mm.
ordinary talent. So the Nazi female guard called Maria Mandel, who was trying to run this orchestra as her own, she thought that would give her more power and prestige,
Mm.
came over and was thrilled. She thought, this is the answer to my prayers. So she said to Alma, I'll give you your freedom. You won't have the operation if in return you run a proper orchestra, and I'll make you capo. Now, that was quite controversial for somebody of
Yeah.
Jewish blood to be made a capo, but she accepted it, and she took on this idea that she could not only save her own life, she could save the lives of all these Jews if she created a marching band that pleased the Nazis. So she increased it from about 12 to 45 and took as many people as she could to orchestrate, to arrange, even to sing, because once she was really in demand, the Nazis wanted not only a marching band, they wanted a Sunday concert, which she
Mm.
provided them with. So it was not a soft option working in this commando. Alma really was a strict taskmaster, a disciplinarian. Partly, I think, because she grew up in this center of excellence, that was all she knew. And partly because she knew if they weren't really good enough, the Nazis would get rid of them. And she used to say to all the orchestra, we'll all go to the gas, you've got to play well. So she was an absolutely intriguing character, and the tragedy is that although she very definitely was responsible for saving at least 45 lives, she died. She couldn't save her own life because
Mm.
I think people were jealous of her power and thought, a Jewish woman shouldn't be as powerful as she is. And she
Yeah.
died of food poisoning in April 1944.
Well, what was a typical day like in the orchestra?
Okay, well, first of all, try and imagine freezing cold. I don't know if anyone listening has been to Auschwitz, but it's something else again. I mean, I've been to cold places and snowy mountains, but this has some exposure to the wind like you can't imagine unless you're there. So you're freezing cold. You've probably had no breakfast, maybe a bit of watery ersatz coffee, hard bit of bread. And at dawn, you have to go out, set up the music stands on the grassy bank, because the women will pass by to go out to the sub camps. You set up the music stands, you've probably got no gloves, or you've got something that passes as gloves, and shoes that let in water, and a sort of rag dress that's probably a bit dirty. You have got underwear. Now, the women in the orchestra were allowed underpants. That was such a luxury. And you've had your own bed, so you may have slept for about five or 6 hours,
Mhm.
and you then have to play to the women going out to work. And it's not real music, I have to say that. It's sort of
Mm.
awful, jaunty marching music, Schubert's Militaire and, the Radetzky March, the same old things. Although, they had a bit of a repertoire, but it was not beautiful music. So they go out to work. They play as the others go out to work, and they know they're hated because the other women think that the orchestra is privileged. I mean, they were. They had their own bed. I don't think they had substantially more food or anything like that. And as I say, the same cold, the same hunger, the same fear. Then they would come back and practice for 8 hours a day. I mean, 8 hours
Yeah.
of practicing, bit of watery soup for lunch, another bit of hard bread. And then they'd go out to play the women back in when they came back from the camps. And that was really the most difficult task because the women were exhausted. Sometimes they had to carry one of their colleagues over their shoulders, dying or dead.
Mm.
And the women in the orchestra had to watch the torments of the Nazis, who would kick the women who'd been out to work if they weren't marching properly in lockstep. and sometimes they'd kick them into a trench and they'd never recover. And, all the while the band played on. So, of course, there's this terrible tension between the women in the camp who had to work outside and how they hated the orchestra because they saw the orchestra as the source of their torment.
Yeah.
It wasn't the orchestra's fault that they had to play. And
So,
then that's
sorry,
the end of their day.
the orchestra was used as a weapon by the Nazis then,
Of
just as it
course.
to torture the
Mm.
women who were going out to be tortured, really.
It was another form of Nazi torture. That's what I try and explain because a
Yeah,
lot of people see these women as collaborators, which makes me so angry.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, I think they were absolutely doing the opposite of collaborating. Of course, they were doing Nazi bidding, but any by that standard, anyone who survived Auschwitz is a collaborator. And I think it's the
mm,
greatest form of resistance to survive. The Nazis are
yeah.
trying to obliterate Jews, obliterate Jewish culture. And these women are saying, we are going to do our damnedest to survive. And they did.
Well, doing this show, I have talked about so many people surviving concentration camps, and they've been through hell and back just to survive. So yeah, I can
Mm.
understand that, and your book explains that very well, indeed. And the orchestra, how did they? Because they're playing the women going out and coming back again. How do they cope with that emotional torment?
I can't speak for all of them. I've
Mm,
interviewed two of them who were
mm,
alive, and one indeed still, Anita Lasker-Wallfisch. And she says, we didn't have the luxury of feelings. We didn't
oh
allow
wow.
ourselves. I don't think she's quite right. I think she may have dealt with it that way.
Mm,
She said all we thought about was putting one step in front of another and surviving till tomorrow. But I think Alma suffered terribly from seeing people she knew arrive on these terrible transportations and be sent straight to the gas. I think the other women found it desperately painful. They weren't asked to play specifically to people being marched to their death, but the music block was very close to the ramp
yeah,
where all the prisoners were disgorged and selections took place. So it happened that prisoners being disgorged heard music, and some of them said to each other, well, it can't be so bad here. Listen, there's music.
Jesus. Yeah.
But it was, I don't think that was a deliberate Nazi deception. That's where the music block was. They didn't
Mhm.
know how loud the practice would be. But when they discovered it had that effect, I think it suited their purposes very
Yeah,
well. And so my real answer to your question is when some of these women were asked in a film how they felt about having to play to women going to their death, they were absolutely strenuous in their denial that they did not play specifically to people going to their deaths. But
yeah,
here's the quote I remember. It was sad enough as it was. You and I do not need to sit here in the comfort of our rooms pontificating about what I'm not suggesting you are, but I try and rein myself in. It's not for me to judge or pontificate on what they did. It was sad enough as it was. They were
yeah,
trying to survive. And I think they all had different survival mechanisms. But I think I would also add that none of them really got over it. I think
mhm,
they all felt the orchestra and their experiences intrude into their post-war lives, and not just for them but second generation and even third generation. I can't tell you how many children of survivors I've interviewed who all say to me, the war was not over in 1945.
mm,
Mostly the difficulties were about food. Well, of course it was about food, but Flora, the accordionist, in her memoir says sometimes my children would say to me, oh, can I have something to eat? I'm starving. And I'd say to them, you don't know what starving means. You're just a bit peckish or you're bored. And those things sometimes led to terrible arguments with
mm,
with children. And, we can see why. And then there was survivor guilt. I mean, it's another story. I'm trying to tell the story of the orchestra in Auschwitz
Yeah.
until 1945. And I can only repeat, it was sad enough as it was. We don't
Mm.
need to exaggerate in any way.
How did Nazi policies change towards the orchestra over the years, if they did?
Well, don't forget the orchestra was only functioning really for about a year,
Mm-hmm.
but I think the way they changed was towards the end of the war because they wanted to remove them from Auschwitz. And when the Nazis realized that the Russians were coming,
Mm-hmm.
they wanted to destroy all evidence of their egregious crimes and get everybody out and destroy all the papers and documents. And this is another bizarre aspect. I mean, amongst the many bizarre aspects, I must talk about the Sunday concerts when Alma was asked to perform opera and managed to get a grand piano in there. I mean, how could the Nazis think that playing great arias from these operas had any role in a camp that was destined
Yeah.
for extermination? It's repulsive, but I don't blame Alma. She was doing what the Nazis wanted, and they saw
Yeah.
themselves as the creators of great music, so they lapped it up. But all of this ended when they feared that the Russians were coming, and they told the orchestra from one day to the next, "Stop now, take your clothes off. We're dividing you again along racial lines. So Jews, you're going in a train into Germany, into this camp called Bergen-Belsen.
Mm-hmm.
Leave everything behind." And the Christians were told, "You're going into Auschwitz one," and eventually they had to do the death march to Ravensbrück. But the Nazis were no kinder. I mean, there was still, even though the war was almost over, there
Mm-hmm.
was still random shootings. Anyone who tried to rebel, they believed that the war was not over, and that there was still a possibility of winning, and they forced the women in the orchestra to watch appalling retribution against people who tried to tell the outside world what was happening. So I don't think there was any softening
Mm.
towards the prisoners or the orchestra. But the thing I want to say about this moment when they separated the orchestra is what that taught me. And what it taught me was the extreme courage of Hilda. Hilda is really my moral compass, if you like. I mean, I think she was a natural leader, and she was a leader to the women in the orchestra. But having been told, "Take your clothes off, put your rags back on, leave everything behind, get in the train." I mean, I'm saying that, but imagine if a Nazi was saying it to you
Yeah.
with a gun or a leather whacking whip. Um, you do what you were told.
Yeah.
Hilda disobeyed orders, went back into the music block. So, first of all, I think, we have to recognize her courage.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing I'd say about this is her extraordinary historical foresight. She went back into the block, not to get practical artifacts like food or a blanket or anything like that. No, she got Alma's diary, because Alma was dead by then. She got her copy of Goethe's Faust, because she always believed that German culture was superior to everything. And she got this little red bag that she had sewn together to carry the music around in. And she kept these artifacts in Belsen and then presented them to Yad Vashem. Why? Because she said future generations just won't believe that this happened. It's such an
Mm-hmm.
extraordinary story. How right she was,
Yeah.
long before Holocaust denial had a name, she knew it would arise. So I feel deeply privileged to have met Hilda and seen some of that spark. She also lived to 100, and I saw her at 99 in
Wow.
Israel. So your question was, how did Nazi policy
Policy
change?
change. Yeah.
It didn't.
Then.
I think right up until the last minute, they were as cruel and strict as ever.
Mm-hmm.
But it changed to the extent that they tried to hide their crimes.
Yeah.
And so that resulted in, obviously, no more orchestra, no more playing, just get out of here and evacuate.
Mm.
They still thought that there was a chance if they couldn't win the war, at least nobody would know what they did. And thank heavens we do know.
Oh, yeah, thank God. What were the relationships like within the orchestra? Did everybody get on? Was there rivalries?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I'd love to have written a book that said, oh, everything was lovely and sweet and
Mm.
harmonious. And, this is a story of sisterhood. And it was sometimes, and it was when they needed it to be, when they pulled together. I mean, it really is a team. And one of them would not have survived, however formidable a player, alone. It was because they pulled together and had a purpose that they survived. But within that, the orchestra, the nationality groups were very important. So the three
Mm.
Belgians, the three French, the Russians, and the Poles, they all stuck together in the block, and they spoke their own language and they supported each other. But actually, there was antipathy towards them, and it often was anti-Semitic. It broke down along racial lines because we keep coming back to food, but the Polish women were allowed to receive food parcels. Many of them had family who were farmers nearby and might deliver eggs or dairy products. It wasn't really enough for everyone to share. So they took the decision that they would not share it with the Jewish members. They argued, we need it, we must look after our own, and the Jewish women can go to the warehouse where they might know people and fend for themselves. So this caused terrible pain, as you can imagine, the
Yeah.
stove in the middle of the room, which Alma got for them to keep the instruments warm. They used it to make scrambled eggs on. And one of the women wrote she could never, ever eat scrambled eggs again because this awful smell um, would linger with her for the rest of her life, and how the women would cook scrambled eggs in this tiny room and not share it. And, so relations were not always good, but when they needed to, when they had to play,
Mhm.
and that's why Alma was so strict. She said, if you don't, we'll all go to the gas. So it worked.
Apart from threatening them with going to the gas chamber, how did Alma enforce discipline within the orchestra?
Well, I think just that. She
Yeah.
just would not allow any soppiness if any of them cried. Crying is not allowed here. And when Anita, who I've talked about, the one who's still alive, and the
Mhm.
really formidable talented cellist, had been ill in the infirmary, and she came back to the orchestra, and she wasn't quite herself. She was weak. And she played an F sharp, not an F natural, and Alma shouted at her and punished her by making her scrub the block floor for the whole week. And, Nita said, I didn't love Alma at that moment, but I
Mhm.
understood. She saved us. That was the purpose of doing it. So they needed this discipline to stay
Yeah.
together, because after Alma died, when it was taken over by Sonia Vinogradova, it just floundered again and collapsed. So, I mean, there is no question in my mind that Alma deserves every praise going for
Mm.
saving these lives. If any of her girls were ill and went into the infirmary, normally that was just a route you'd then be gassed because you
Mm.
were weak and ill. And Alma insisted to the Nazis, if my girls are in the infirmary, I've trained them, I've developed them, you can do whatever you can to give them, this meager Nazi medicine and look after them and get them well. I want them back. So going to the infirmary used to be just a day before you were killed. But if you were in the orchestra, it wasn't, because Alma looked after you. So, they developed this bond. She was a sort of mother figure. She was unbelievably talented. She came
Mm.
from musical royalty. They believed her. And, they were prepared to work for her. And the stick and the carrot, the other side of your question, is that she tried to reward them. she couldn't give them food or anything practical,
Mm.
but she rewarded them with praise. The greatest praise was to say, "Ha, my father would be proud of you." I mean, they all knew that was the
Yeah.
ultimate praise she could give. My father would be pleased with you. Or she played them, for example, Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in E minor. I mean, it's the most beautiful piece of music, a real violin um, solo that just, is visceral. It reduces me
Mm.
to jelly listening to that well played. And to imagine her playing that as a reward, because of course Mendelssohn, being a Jewish composer, was forbidden. So there was an element of resistance in it too. And you just have to imagine these young girls in this block hoping they might live to hear real music, and Alma prepared to risk everything by playing Mendelssohn. So it wasn't always just telling them we'll all be gassed. There
Yeah.
was some reward in the treatment as well.
Well, unfortunately, in April 1944, as you mentioned, Alma died, apparently from a viral infection. But do you think it was a viral infection or do you think she was poisoned?
Oh, I'm sure she was.
Mm.
I think it was botulism, food poisoning. I mean, I guess we don't know if it was accidental or deliberate, but I think she made a lot of enemies. She made enemies because people didn't like the authority that she had as a Jewish woman to sit down with this Nazi guard, Maria Mandel, and discuss the orchestra. They thought that was disgusting and deceitful. And the jealousies and the rivalries in Auschwitz were enormous, and there were women who were angry that she hadn't taken them into the orchestra. I'm thinking of one in
Mm.
particular, Puffmutti Muscular, this German yodeler who begged Alma at the Christmas concert to take her on, and Alma refused. She didn't want some yodeler in the orchestra. That wasn't what it was about at all. And, that wasn't what Alma was trying to do.
Yeah.
And there was no way she would have her. So I just mentioned her. It could have been her. Uh, Alma had had a birthday dinner with another capo, non-Jewish, called Frau Schmidt. Frau Schmidt did get ill, but not so ill to die.
Mm.
So clearly there was something in what they ate and drank. I've
Yeah.
mentioned that Alma was a risk taker. Why did she drink unadulterated or sorry, adulterated alcohol? It's just so crazy in a place
Mm.
like Auschwitz, but she did. And we'll never know. I mean, the Nazis did an autopsy on her, which is a bit bizarre to do an autopsy on a Jewish woman in Auschwitz when you're
Yeah.
killing them as fast as you can. But I think that's because they were a bit scared that it might be some infectious disease and they didn't want to succumb to it themselves. So just so desperately sad.
It is very, very sad. And how did that change? How did her death change the orchestra?
Oh, it was finished, really. I
Mm.
mean, luckily it was towards the end of 44. It continued for a bit with Sonia Vinogradova. But the other thing is there was this huge influx after Alma's death of the Jews from Hungary. And they could have had five orchestras with all the talented Hungarian Jewish musicians. They took a few more at this point. Um, but really, Sonia Vinogradova was not interested in doing what Alma did. She kept it going as a marching band, but the
Mm.
Sunday concerts finished, and that's what the Nazis had loved so much. So they just kept going for another 6 months until early November when the Nazis realized the game was up. The
Yeah.
Soviets were approaching.
And what happened to the members of the orchestra during liberation?
Well, some of them were sent to Belsen, the Jewish ones,
Mm.
and there was no orchestra there. And although Belsen was not an extermination camp, people died of illness and disease and malnutrition, and two members of the orchestra succumbed at that point. And for the others, it was really touch and go until April the 15th when the
Mm.
British liberated. And the Christian members had to do this unimaginable death march to Ravensbrück, and they were given,
Mm.
one loaf of bread to see them through for the whole time. So you would expect they all died of starvation as well, but amazingly they didn't. But the orchestra was over at this point.
And Ravensbrück wasn't an easy place to be either, was it? So
No,
not,
completely ghastly, all
yeah.
of it. I had already been to Ravensbrück for a previous book. I've been to Dachau. I've been to Trostenetz in Minsk, where they had mobile gassing vans.
Mm.
Buchenwald in Weimar, that's ghastly.
Wow.
And I really thought I didn't need to go to Auschwitz. I thought, 5 camps is enough. I know the horrors, but I was quite wrong, because Auschwitz is something else again. And I think I probably should go to Belsen, although Belsen is only a grassy mound now. There's
Mm.
nothing to see, but I just want to be there, to tread the
Yeah.
ground. So it's a sort of compulsion, and I think once you've seen Auschwitz, you really have a different view on what humanity is capable of. And even though I'd read about it and I knew it, I knew it intellectually, in my
Mm.
gut, to see this extraordinary industrial attempt to kill human beings only because of their race, religion, looks,
Mm.
whatever excuse they used, just changes you. I think I've certainly become a different person, actually, since doing this
It'll
book.
be my first trip there this year.
Okay, well,
So
don't rush it. I mean, I don't know how long you're going for, but um, well, I'll be interested to hear if you feel differently, because you've
um
obviously read a lot of books
yeah,
about it, but somehow seeing it.
yeah, yeah. Even the books make me feel ill.
Mm.
So and how do the members reflect on their orchestra years? I know we've talked about this a little bit, um, about having survivor's guilt, etc. And you say they passed it down the line to their relatives.
Well, I think all the work that's being done these days talks about trauma begets
Hmm.
trauma. And mostly they wanted to get on with their lives, get married, have children, normality, not talk about it. And we're now told that's not good. It's better to talk about it. So I don't really want to generalize, because it is such a huge subject. And I think I understand most of them were of childbearing age. They wanted to get married, have babies. That's a normal human urge.
Mm.
But as Flora said, I should never have been allowed to have babies in 1946, because my mind was still in the camps. She
Mm.
actually married the fiance of her dead sister. Her sister was in the Dutch resistance, taken to Sobibor, no orchestra in Sobibor, so her
Yeah,
sister was
the other
killed.
one.
And, that adds an additional level of guilt. And
Mm.
then there are complications when one sister saved another sister. I mean, of course, at one level, you're grateful for being saved. At another level, no human being likes to owe their life to another in a
Yeah.
way. So, endless difficulties of getting on with life. And the real difficulty is, where were they going to live? And in Belsen, this term was initiated, DP, displaced person, and they couldn't go back to Germany, Austria, Poland, because their homes had been destroyed, their families destroyed, they had nowhere to live. But they couldn't get a home in America, Australia, Britain, New Zealand,
Mm.
Canada. All these places had horrendous quotas against taking in Jews, and America was one of the worst. So
Yeah.
they were stuck in Belsen. Belsen didn't close till 1950. If I'm passionate about anything, I'm passionate about the inhumanity of these countries that didn't take people for whom everything had been destroyed. Where were they meant to go? So many of them tried to go to Palestine, not because they were Zionists. They did not want to live in that country. A few did. But even there, the British were not allowing people into Palestine. I mean,
Mm.
when you think about what these people suffered and the traumas, and then what was laid on them in 1945, and where
Yeah.
were they meant to go? Just honestly, the 20th century is such a black century. I think I
Yeah.
concluded that I couldn't call myself a historian of the 20th century until I wrote about the Holocaust, because
Mm.
it's such a central calamity. It is unique.
Yeah.
And even though there are other horrors that are ghastly, this particular horror has just a special awfulness. And for me, I'm just really pleased that I have written about one tiny corner of it. And although it's only 45 women who survived, I think their strength and resilience is remarkable.
But it's a very important story. Um, why did it take so long to get out there?
Well, there have no, I mean, although mine is the first book that looks at the orchestra in a whole, that
Hmm.
looks at the new research, that looks at um, how the other prisoners responded. So my book is sort of
Yeah.
360 degrees. It's not just about the orchestra. One or two had written memoirs. But I think it's because most people thought it was more important to get on with their lives and bring up their families, not to
Hmm.
hark back on this terrible time, which, as soon as they thought about it, often resulted in severe mental trauma. So I get it. You know, it
Yeah.
needed probably somebody like me with a bit of, I like to think, objectivity and distance and, historical perspective and all of those things. I mean, there may be other books, there may be, I hate to imagine it, but there may be other members of the orchestra that I didn't know about who'll suddenly emerge. So, I never say that anything I've written is the last word, but I think it was, in a sense, the first time that anyone had really pulled all these threads together.
And why do you think this particular story is important for people to know?
Because I think we're in danger of forgetting the horrific damage that anti-Semitism does. Stand up for tolerance as soon as you see it. And once you start, I mean, there's some horrible expression that Auschwitz was just, I'm not even going to use it, but the end process. Because before Auschwitz, which killed 1.8 million Jews, we know that 6 million Jews were killed overall. They were killed before Auschwitz. They were killed by Hitler's willing executioners, as they're
Yeah.
known, in Latvia, Lithuania, in all sorts of places. People who
Mhm.
just thought, oh, I hate these Jews. They've got better jobs than I have. That sort of ghastly intolerance
Yeah.
is something that should be called out the minute you see it. So although we think of Auschwitz as the uh, epitome of the Holocaust, actually, it was sort of the end point. Even before Auschwitz, Jews had been being killed all over Europe. And I think the reason it matters is because we're in danger of forgetting what it means to say you hate somebody just because of the color of their skin or the
Yeah.
size of their nose or whatever it is that you don't like. I can't believe how low we sink sometimes in terms of intolerance. It's just, and I'm sure I'm guilty as well. I'm not making out that I'm such a tolerant person, but I do try.
Hmm. I think, unfortunately, today it's it's getting worse. Unfortunately,
Well,
the
we all keep saying
intolerance.
that, but what can we do to stop it and just
Yeah.
to welcome people who are different into our lives and to embrace difference at every stage?
Yeah. All we can be is kind ourselves. That's all we can do.
Oh, Kind is such an important, a four-letter word that is everything. I couldn't agree
Yeah.
with you more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And finally, what's next for you, Anne?
Oh, that is the hardest question of the whole hour because I desperately want to write another story and I can't quite find anything that matters as much as this. It's
Mm.
terrible. I mean, there must be other war stories, and I just haven't found them yet. So if anyone listening has a great story that needs to be written, I'm not happy being bookless. I mean, I'm busy and I'm a journalist and I'm writing
Yeah.
articles and all the rest of it. But actually, I'm sure there are important war stories that need to be told, and um, I haven't got there yet. So I'm just spending my day mostly talking about this. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it once again, because it really, really is a privilege. I know that's an overused word, but I can't tell you how fortunate I feel to be a spokesperson for these amazing women and girls.
Well, this is a fantastic book, an important book. And like I said, I'll put a link down below so everybody can grab a copy. And in March, the paperback, as you so eloquently showed us, is coming out in March. So everybody get your hands on that. So, Anne Sebba, all I can say is thank you so much for joining me today. It's been really nice talking to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for inviting me. Good.
You
I look forward to seeing the finished result. Glad we
okay?
got there in the end. Bye now.
Bye now. Take care.
And you.